In the last video, we finished Jehoshaphat's reign. It was mostly positive, but there was some negative mixed in there, and that was mostly, if not solely, his allying with the north. It nearly cost him his life in the battle at Ramoth Gilead. But an even bigger failure was his marrying his son Jehoram to Ahab's daughter Athaliah, because that is nearly going to wipe out the entire Davidic line in this section that we're going to deal with today. And as usual, I would suggest that you read out the entire passage or listen to it, because we're mostly going to summarize as we move along. And the first 3 verses are summarizing that transitionary period between Jehoshaphat and Jehoram. And in spite of Jehoshaphat's efforts to appease all of his children, all of his sons, he gives them gifts and fortified cities and these kinds of things. He ultimately gives rule to Jehoram. But we read in verse 4, when Jehoram had ascended the throne of his father and was established, he killed all his brothers with the sword. In that language of the sword will become important. And also some of the princes of Israel. And so even with all of Jehoshaphat's preparations, it doesn't matter. Jehoram immediately squanders those plans. And as verse 6 tells us, that he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel and the house of Ahab. And it points out the reason for this, because the daughter of Ahab was his wife, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And so while this didn't affect Jehoshaphat during his life, this decision to ally with Ahab, even after his death, is going to continue to impact his kingdom. And it should be noted that this language here in verse 4, ascended the throne as well as was established, these are key terms that we've come across throughout Chronicles during transitionary periods. But as Johnstone points out, Jehoram's way of becoming established has nothing to do with reliance on the promise of God. It is to eliminate all possible rivals. He slaughtered all his brothers with the sword, and also some of the leaders of Israel. The reign that thus begins in terror and repression is soon to end in disaster. And we move down to verse 7, yet the Lord was not willing to destroy the house of David because of the covenant that he made with David, and since he had promised to give a lamp to him and to his sons forever. And this lamp language is a direct callback to 1 Kings 11:36. But here Johnstone is noting the structure of verse 7, which is chiastic, and it centers on the covenant that Yahweh makes with David. But perhaps of bigger interest to us here is this language here of destroy. It's very interesting. So Johnstone says, highly serviceable to Chronicles' purpose is the echo of the language of the Passover narrative in Exodus in verse 7. The Lord was unwilling to destroy the house of David. To destroy, in Chronicles usage, cross refers to the destroyer in Exodus 12:13, as well as verse 23. The agent of the Lord who slew the firstborn of Egypt, and from whom Israel was protected by the blood of the Passover. Repeatedly, Chronicles makes use of the motifs of the Passover, both positively and negatively. Compare 1 Chronicles 21:12. Here, it is the very firstborn of the current generation of the house of David who threatens to bring the destruction of a negative Passover down on his own house and people. And then he points out that we're going to get some of this plague language in verse 14. But the bigger point that he's making is whereas the Passover in Egypt was over the firstborn, and of course they were protected by the Passover lamb, here the firstborn of Israel, Jehoram, is slaughtering the sons of Israel. And then we get down in verses 8 through 10, the rebellion of Edom as well as Libnah. And Johnstone points out here that the rebellion here of Edom, it really cost them as far as the lucrative expeditions go. So this has big economic impact. And verse 9 is a little odd because it reads, Then Jehoram passed over with his commanders and all his chariots, and he rose by night and struck the Edomites who had surrounded him and his chariot commanders. And then it continues, so Edom revolted from the rule of Judah to this day. What's odd about this is it doesn't really make sense because Edom is throwing off the yoke of Israel, essentially. Yet, the way the narrative reads, it makes it sound like he actually won this battle, which he couldn't have. And so there's actually quite a bit of debate about this. So a lot of commentators think that either it should be amended to read that the Edomites struck him, or in this case, smote him, or to understand that Jehoram just managed to break out of the position where he had been surrounded, and so to escape with his life. And Klein similarly makes the point that the chronicler may have understood this text to mean that Jehoram had narrowly escaped the Edomite encirclement by striking them. But the difference between Jehoram striking the Edomites and being struck by the Edomites is really the difference in one letter. And so it is possible that in textual transmission that single letter was dropped out, and so it should just simply read that he was struck by the Edomites. But either way, his losing ground, his losing people, and of course the rebellion also of Libnah is important because they served as a buffer between Judah and the Philistines, who are going to figure down in verse 16. But moving down to verse 11, moreover, he made high places in the hill country of Judah, and led the inhabitants of Jerusalem into whoredom, and made Judah go astray. And a letter came to him from Elijah the prophet, saying, and then it's going to launch into that letter. I do want to note this here by Johnstone, though. He points out here that Jehoram has implicated his people in failure to accord God his exclusive rights to Israel's allegiance, as of one spouse to the other. He has driven his people away from practicing their role. And he points out here that in verse 9, the verb may be continuing the metaphor of fornication. It is used of seduction by a prostitute in Proverbs 7:21. But this letter by the prophet Elijah is going to charge him with this, enticing the people to go after other gods, and he also chastises him for having killed his brothers of your father's house who are better than you. And he tells him in verse 14, behold, the Lord will bring a great plague on your people, your children, your wives, and all your possessions. Children here should probably be sons. We'll hit that in a moment. And you yourself will have a severe sickness with a disease of your bowels, until your bowels come out because of the disease day by day. And so once again, we have this Exodus typology. Johnstone writes, the impending act of God is another negative Exodus. God's great acts of deliverance are now thrown into reverse. Massive blows or great plagues, such as had once struck Egypt, but from which Israel itself had been protected, are now turned upon Israel, upon your people, your sons. And he points out probably not children, as the NRSV as well as the ESV. Your wives and all your property, even you yourself. And the reason why he thinks that's the case, and it probably is the case that should be sons, is because the continuation of this is he's going to lose his sons. Specifically, this lineage is going to die out. So it makes more sense to see this reference as to his sons specifically. The list of persons and things threatened is highly significant. The threat to the king is a threat to the people, whose representative he is. The threat to his sons and to his sons' wives is a threat to the royal dynasty and the means of perpetuating that dynasty. The threat to property is to those physical emblems of prosperity and recognition that lie at the heart of the Davidic regime. Jehoram himself has become like Pharaoh, the object of God's own punitive actions, and thus the cause of the ruin of his people. His own fate is to die the slow, agonizing, and degrading death of a progressive disease of the bowels, a stricken king like Saul. And he's pointing out that this being sick language, the antonym of heal, of course, the healing language goes back to if the king in the temple, if he prays to God, he will be healed and things like that. And so it uses this language, severe sickness, more literally with the sickness of your bowels until your bowels come out because of the sickness. So it's just repeating this. You're going to be sick. Now in verse 16, this is actually rather interesting in light of some of the divine counsel stuff we've seen in the last couple chapters, because it reads, and the Lord stirred up against Jehoram the anger of the Philistines. Now, literally, you see a footnote here. It's actually ruah. It's spirit. So the spirit of the Philistines and of the Arabians who are near the Ethiopians. And Lightheart writes here, these rebellions are not accidental. Nations have spirits, which Yahweh, the spirit of all, stirs up to invade Judah. So basically Deuteronomy 32 kind of stuff. The Arabs plunder the king's house and take away all the king's sons and daughters, except Jehoahaz, Jehoram's youngest son. Jehoram is given a preview of what will happen when Israel and Judah again play the harlot. Assyria will invade and plunder, and then Babylon. It is a reverse conquest that follows an inversion of the Exodus. The Davidic dynasty is being reduced, partly by invading Gentiles, mostly because of the unfaithfulness of David's own descendants. And Johnstone makes a similar point. And of course, this being the Philistines, it adds even more insult to injury here, because as Lightheart points out, the Cushites are behind the Arab invasion. An ominous note. Asa defeated a gigantic Cushite army, but only because he cried to Yahweh. Because Jehoram refuses to turn to Yahweh, he will be overwhelmed by this power from the deep south. Philistines are related to Egyptians in the Table of Nations. Subjection to Philistia is yet another inverted exodus. Philistines were among David's main enemies, whom he subdued before Solomon took the throne. Now Philistines are back, a sign of the deep reversal of the history of the Davidic dynasty. And we've seen this in the last couple chapters. The people that David and Solomon had subdued are now coming back to be a thorn in the side of Judah and Israel. In verse 18, after all of this, the Lord struck him and his bowels with an incurable disease. And Lightheart writes, as in the case of Asa, the sickness of the king embodies the sickness of the land. Jehoram's disease is worse, striking him in the bowels instead of on the feet. The infection is spreading, and the king and his kingdom are nearing their deathbeds. In Exodus 15:26, the Lord promises not to let any of the diseases of Egypt fall on Israel. Now that the house of David is abandoning the Lord and turning to false gods, the diseases of the nations infect them. There is a solution. Jehoram could turn to the Lord in his house and cry out for healing. The Lord has promised to hear and heal, hear and save. Jehoram clings too closely to the gods of Ahab to do that. He is sickened by his idolatries and bloodshed, as is the land itself. Continuing with verse 19 and following, he eventually dies after 2 years. His bowels come out because of the sickness, and he died in great agony. His people made no fire in his honor, like the fires made for his fathers. He was 32 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. And he departed with no one's regret. They buried him in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. This is interesting because it's missing a typical line about how he lay with the fathers, with the ancestors or whatever. I wonder if this isn't something like we get in the laws in the Old Testament, because there's an oddity. You sometimes get phrases like that people would be cut off from their people. And scholars wonder about that, whether that's simple exile or whether that is execution, capital punishment. However, you also have phrases that clearly are talking about execution, where it'll talk about the blood being on their head, or they shall surely die, or they shall surely be put to death. You have phrases like that. But in some of those, you have the line added at the end of that, and they will be cut off from the people, which seems really odd. And so there are two ways of looking at that. Either it means the same thing twice. They are executed and they're cut off from the people, which means the same thing. Or that phrase, being cut off from the people, is, in that context at least, is referring to the afterlife. It's saying that even in the afterlife, they're cut off from the people. There's no being gathered, in Abraham's bosom kind of language. You're cut off from any hope in the afterlife. And so I wonder if a note like this, where it's lacking that notes, that the laying with the fathers kind of idea, if it's not just simply referring to the tombs of the kings, but in addition, the failure to mention that is a theological point, that they're cut off also in the afterlife. But who knows? Either way, we're in chapter 22 now, which begins, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, his youngest son, the king in his place, For the band of men that came with the Arabians to the camp had killed all the older sons. So Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, reigned. What's really interesting here is this language of band of men. So Johnstone points out here that it was a raiding party, which is the way he translates this instead of band of men, among the Arabs who inflicted these losses on the royal house. It had been precisely as a raiding party, or a band of men, that David's followers had first established themselves in 1 Chronicles 12:18 as well as verse 21. That raiding party of Arabs had penetrated the camp of Israel, that traditional term for the host of Israel on the field of battle. Such were Israel's reduced circumstances, that the Lord's sacramental host had themselves now been worsened by a mere band of raiders. As they had gained power, so now they have almost lost it. And that is quite the fall from grace, because, as he notes, they do begin with this kind of terminology, and then eventually we're going to get the language about the camp being the camp of the Lord, where the camp of David is the camp of God kind of idea. But now they've been reduced so dramatically that just random raiders, random groups of men are able to defeat their entire army. And it's because of this that the youngest son, Ahaziah, has to reign. And it has in here in verse 2 that Ahaziah was 22 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. Of course, this is Athaliah, the one from the marriage alliance. This is the wife of Jehoram. But continuing in verse 3, he also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor in doing wickedly. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, as the house of Ahab had done. For after the death of his father, they were his counselors to his undoing. He even followed their counsel and went with Jehoram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, to make war against Hazael, the king of Syria, at Ramoth Gilead. So there they are back again at Ramoth Gilead. And Jehoram is going to be wounded in this battle, in this encounter. But there's some interesting terminology here, especially here in verse 4, to his undoing, as it's translated. But Johnstone more literally points out that destroyer again picks up the vocabulary of Exodus 12:13 and verse 23. So that's what this term is actually referring to. Here, once more, the motif of the negative Passover, 1 Chronicles 21:12, is being employed. The king of the house of David is called to realize, in his day, the Mosaic tradition of deliverance and duty. But this king permits the house of Ahab to continue to be the agent of destruction against his own people more effectively than any pharaoh. That's a very sobering point to make, and this terminology is just underlying this idea that this is a complete reversal of the Exodus. And so after this battle with the Syrians, where Jehoram is wounded, Ahaziah goes down to Jezreel to meet with the wounded Joram. And we pick up in verse 7, but it was ordained by God. That's the ESV's bias showing here. Ordained is in the text. It basically means it was from God that the downfall of Ahaziah should come about through his going to visit Joram. So as is there to visit the wounded uncle, he is going to be met by Jehu, the son of Nimshi, whom the Lord had anointed to destroy the house of Ahab. Of course, we don't get this detail. This is in Kings, and it's Elisha who anoints him to execute judgment on the house of Ahab. And by extension, he's also then going to seek out the sons of Ahaziah's brothers who attended Ahaziah, and he killed them. He searched for Ahaziah, and he was captured while hiding in Samaria. And he was brought to Jehu and put to death. They buried him, for they said, "He is the grandson of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart." And the house of Ahaziah had no one able to rule the kingdom. And so it's out of respect for Jehoshaphat that they bury him. And as Johnstone writes, at the climax of the narrative, Chronicles' key word for behavior that is acceptable to the Lord in the ultimate degree is introduced. And it's this sought language right here. So to seek is to accord to the Lord all that is due to him by giving him priority in all things. By contrast with the competence of Jehoshaphat for rule, the house of Ahaziah is reduced to total impotence. And so now with no one to rule, they turn now in verse 10 to Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal family of the house of Judah. But Jehoshabeth, or Jehoshabah, the daughter of the king, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were about to be put to death. And she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Thus Jehoshabeth, the daughter of King Jehoram, and the wife of Jehoiada, the priest, because she was the sister of Ahaziah, hid him from Athaliah, so that she did not put him to death. And he remained with them 6 years, hidden in the house of God, while Athaliah reigned over the land. And picking up with Johnstone, he points out here that the parallels in this narrative with the rescue of the infant Moses are striking and highly opposite. Not opposite. It is accordingly highly appropriate that there should be parallels between the tale of the infancy of Moses in Exodus 1:2 and the infancy of Joash, the new Davidic king. In both cases, there is a systematic attempt to slaughter all the relevant male children. In both, there is a royal princess, the ruler's own daughter, who frustrates the designs of the royal parent. In both, there is the hiding of the child and the procuring of a wet nurse. Chronicles preserves here from Kings a further example of the typology that he has been developing between David and Moses. And also, Johnstone points out, as the poison had been introduced by a woman, so it is neutralized by a woman. Athaliah's own daughter, Jehoshabeth, the Lord is abundance, sister of the dead king Ahaziah, who was also the wife of the high priest, Jehoiada, the Lord knows, frustrates her mother's ultimate design by rescuing her infant nephew Joash, the Lord has provided, son of Ahaziah, and hides him with his nurse in a bedchamber in the temple complex. Thanks to her position as high priest's wife, she is able to keep Joash concealed in an area inaccessible to the laity for 6 years. And it should be noted here that we have this language that he is hidden in the house of God. This mirrors Ahaziah. So I write, this language of hiding foreshadows his own, that is, Ahaziah's own son, being hidden from his mother. But where Ahaziah is hiding in the land of the apostate north, Joash is hidden in the house of God. And so as we move down to chapter 23, Athaliah is reigning, and she's been reigning for 6 or 7 years roughly. In verse 1 reads, "But in the 7th year Jehoiada took courage and entered into a covenant with the commanders of hundreds." And here it's going to list what are essentially co-conspirators. But what's interesting here is this took courage language is typical of kings, as Johnson points out. Chronicles begins the narrative of the counter-revolution by saying that Jehoiada, here the high priest, gathered his courage. This is the same word that is used to describe a new king being established on the throne. So, for example, the first verse of 2 Chronicles. And I want to loop back to this 7th year language at the end. Now, it'll probably be easiest to just summarize through much of this. But Jehoiada gathers the Levites from all the cities of Judah. So the leaders, the heads of the fathers' houses, he says, "Behold the king's son, let him reign, as the Lord spoke concerning the sons of David." And so he's going to position the priests and the Levites and gatekeepers. He's going to put them strategically around so that they can anoint Joash. And in verse 7, "The Levites shall surround the king, each with his weapons in hand, and whoever enters the house shall be put to death. Be with the king when he comes in and when he goes out." Now, concerning this language, specifically of this weapons language, because generically it probably would mean something more like equipment, using a generic term, because Johnstone writes, "In light of the use of the word in 1 Chronicles 9:28 and 29, it would be natural to take instruments in the sense of cultic utensils and implements, or musical instruments. But in the immediate context, it is more likely that weapons are intended, so that any profane person presuming to enter the temple may be ejected by force." So normally the Levites' equipment, their utensils are their instruments and things like that. But here, their instruments are swords, spears, shields. In this sense, they become like human cherubim, protecting not God, but protecting the king. And Lightheart here writes, the Levites gathered to protect the king, each with his weapons in his hand, specifically spears and shields. That's further down. We read that. Jehoiada wants them to be like Phinehas, who speared a fornicating couple that was defiling the holy camp in Numbers 25. Levites have killed before, not just Phinehas. They received priestly status because of their zeal in slaughtering calf worshippers at the foot of Mount Sinai. They filled their hands with swords, and so Yahweh filled their hands to carry out priestly duties. Here again, they fill their hands with spears in order to kill. And what Lightheart is noting is this concept we've come across a couple of times. Often it gets translated conceptually as something like consecrate, but literally it means to fill the hand. And so here he's saying they're literally filling their hands with weapons. So it's in this way they're being consecrated for this task. And down to verse 8, the Levites and all of Judah did according to all that Jehoiada the priest commanded. And they each brought his men who were to go off duty on the Sabbath with those who were to come on duty on the Sabbath. For Jehoiada the priest did not dismiss the divisions. That's an important detail. So Jehoiada is gathering all the Levites and the leaders, each with all of their men. And then he's not dismissing them, because normally they served in these cycles, but they don't get dismissed at the shift change, so to speak. So there would have been a lot of Levites, a lot of priests, a lot of people, but he needs these people because he needs them to be stationed around so that they can carry this out. Moving down to verse 9, and Jehoiada the priest gave to the captains the spears and the large and small shields that had been King David's, which were in the house of God. It's an interesting detail. Apparently these were David's. And he set all the people as a guard for the king, every man with his weapon in his hand, from the south side of the house to the north side of the house, around the altar and the house. And they brought out the king's son and put a crown on him, and gave him the testimony. And they proclaimed him king, and Jehoiada and his sons anointed him. And they said, long live the king. And here Lightheart is kind of commenting on how they kind of pulled this off. So he says, the large number of Levites will not rouse suspicion, because he says it's a Sabbath. Now, Johnstone is actually going to offer even more detail, and that's very interesting. I want to loop back to that. But Jehoiada arranges for both groups to remain in the temple. Those who go out and those who come in will form a great assembly in the temple, none of them dismissed from service. He deploys a third at the gates of the temple, another third at the king's house, another third at the gates of the foundation. Every entrance and exit is guarded, so that the coronation can be carried out without interruption. And Johnstone here is noting that the fact that they don't dismiss the divisions here in verse 8. The other time you have this, as he points out, is the temple dedication in 2 Chronicles 5:11. So these are very unique circumstances. Here, re-inaugurating the Davidic kingdom and the establishment of the temple. And picking up with Lightheart on this crown language, as Johnstone observes, the word for crown is related to Nazarite. So it's Nazarite, the individual who is separated from ordinary life by an oath of abstinence and dedication. Number 6. The crown is thus the symbol of exclusive dedication to the one to whose service he is set apart. Thus it is also used of the high priest's consecration and of the diadem, which is the symbol of that consecration. Joash, in short, wears a crown like Jehoiada, the priest's own golden crown. Jehoiada has functioned as a surrogate father to the infant Joash. Fittingly, the crown of the son resembles the crown of the father. More, the usage points to the Melchizedekal priest kingliness of the Davidic kings, a theme highlighted throughout Chronicles. And then we have this language also of the testimony, edut, that they give to him. And this is actually really interesting. There's a lot going on here. Now, most are going to point out that this testimony language connects to the Ark of the Covenant. And Lightheart writes that Joash is given something called the testimony along with his crown. This is another way of saying that Joash's coronation restores Yahweh's kingship in Judah. With the human ark throne, Joash ascending to the chosen city, to the throne of David, which is Yahweh's throne. Joash is the bearer of the Lord's presence, the throne of the Lord in person. Johnstone also, again, is picking up on this But moving down, the strongest association of the word testimony in the Hebrew Bible is, however, with the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, as attestation of the nature of God's relation with Israel and with the Ark of the Testimony, so called because the Ark contained the tablets on which the Decalogue was inscribed. And then he concludes that this is probably the way the chronicler was thinking of it, because he's going to invoke Moses shortly after this in chapter 24, verse 6, which we're not going to get to today. I want to go ahead and throw in this bit from The Myth That Is True from Heiser. It's basically the pre-published version of The Unseen Realm. And this is somewhat fitting since we've hit some divine council stuff in the last couple of chapters. But he has an interesting connection with this testimony language, edut. In this section has been dealing with the concept of the law delivered by angels. You get this phrase most explicitly in Galatians 3, but the concept shows up a few times in the New Testament, and it comes from the Greek in the Old Testament. But what it's describing is when the law was given to Moses at Sinai by the angel of the Lord, the heavenly host, the heavenly entourage, was also there. And so as he writes here, there's this relationship between the law and the divine council, and there's some interesting wordplay in the Hebrew Old Testament. He says, for example, the Hebrew word for counsel, as in the divine council in Psalm 82, is edut. And in fact, we have encountered this edut language uniquely in 2 Chronicles 5. It's early in this section, and it says here, the congregation of Israel. And as you can see here, it's edut. And the reason why it's interesting is because, again, this is the only time this term edut shows up for congregation in Chronicles. And part of the reason why it would do so is, as you can see, it highlights this over here because it's creating somewhat of a pun on this language, like of the tent of meeting and that kind of thing. But as Heiser is going to point out, there's some terminological stuff and conceptual things going on that tied the tent of meeting to the Ark of the Covenant, to this edut language, stuff like that. And in fact, this is the bringing of the Ark into the temple. So it's not surprising that this word would suddenly show up here and only here, because usually the congregation is the kahal, ecclesia. And we've encountered that language quite a bit, but here it's uniquely this term. But he's doing so to link it back with this tent of meeting era, the wilderness era, back to Moses, stuff like that. But it's continuing back with Heiser. He says, note the two consonants are D and T respectively. This word is used throughout the Old Testament and is frequently translated congregation. It is used of the nation of Israel roughly 100 times in the Pentateuch, the edut Israel. The law dispensed in the presence of the divine edut at Sinai is often called the edut, same consonants but different vowels, since both words come from the same basic root in Hebrew. And of course, this is that testimony language. And he continues, the tablets of the law handed to Moses by the visible Yahweh on Sinai were at first kept in the tent of meeting and then the tabernacle, inside the Ark of the Covenant. As such, all of these items came to be referred to as the edut. The mercy seat above the Ark of the Covenant, the place where Yahweh met with Moses, was therefore said to be above the edut, again, the testimony. All of these items and the nation itself were verbally and therefore mentally interconnected with Yahweh and the divine council on Sinai. The imagery is supplemented by realizing that Israel was corporately referred to as the son or sons of God. The law was truly a gift from heaven for Yahweh's earthly council of sons and daughters. It was the handbook for divine kingdom thinking and living. So when we read about this child king, the last son, given the testimony, the edut, whatever exactly that entailed, to an ancient reader or listener, it would evoke all this imagery. Moses at Sinai in the presence of the Lord, and the divine edut giving the edut, which Moses brings back to the human edut congregation. It's just another of these Moses Exodus connections we've seen so often in Chronicles. And then we have Joash proclaimed king and anointed. And in this section, it's interesting because it's actually referring to him as the son of the king, not by his actual name, but he's anointed to shouts of long live the king, which, interestingly enough, is a phrase used specifically in instances where succession is disputed. So it's saying this is the king, not that pretender over there. And so in the commotion of all this fanfare, we get down to verse 12. When Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and praising the king, she went into the house of the Lord to the people. And when she looked, there was the king standing by his pillar at the entrance, and the captains and the trumpeters beside the king, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets, and the singers with their musical instruments leading in celebration. And Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, treason, treason. And then moving down to verse 14 and following, Jehoiada is going to arrest her. And he says, bring out between the ranks. Anyone who follows her is to be put to death with the sword. For the priest said, do not put her to death in the house of the Lord. So they laid hands on her, or literally made a path for her, or something to that effect. And she went into the entrance of the horse gate of the king's house, and they put her to death there. Now, a couple of items of interest here. Although Johnstone does give an argument for not a pillar, but a platform, which it kind of makes sense if they're kind of anointing him. You have this child, you put him on this platform, whatever. But many of the commentators do actually think that it's referring to Jachin and Boaz, the pillars outside of the temple. And Lightheart points out here that Boaz would actually make sense, since that's, as he puts it, the royal pillar. And Athaliah tears her robes in really a sign of mourning. That's generally what that represents, what it symbolizes. And Klein says her charge of treason or conspiracy is quite self-serving, since she herself had killed off the royal family in order to obtain the throne for herself. She cannot flee, and her cry is useless because of Jehoiada's preparations. And moving down to verse 16, and Jehoiada made a covenant between himself and all the people and the king, that they should be the Lord's people. It's very interesting because through much of this, you have Jehoiada acting almost in the role of the king. He takes leadership in so much of the stuff that's going on in this narrative. But we'll pick up with Lightheart. He says, Judah covenants together to be Yahweh's people, and is referring here to this phrase. In Hebrew, this is a series of 3 prepositional phrases, each starting with the preposition. And that's a lamed. It's supposed to be a lamed. It looks basically a 1, but he's referring to this right here. This preposition usually means to, but it can also mean as or for. This phrase could be translated to be as the people for Yahweh. Yahweh is the end, goal, and aim of Judah's entire national existence. The people of Judah have abundant life because their life is directed to Yahweh, and they are called to do all they do for Yahweh. The initial phrase, to be, is a pun on Yahweh's own name, which comes from the Hebrew verb to be. As you can see, I mean, it's this term here. It's obviously quite similar. Yahweh, the God who is, the great I am, is the very substance of the covenant. For Israel to be at all is to commune with and be directed toward Yahweh. This is what covenant life is, existing, being as a people directed to and for Yahweh. And so the people went to the house of Baal and tore it down. His altars, his images, they broke in pieces. They killed Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. And they're going to essentially reinstall typical worship. They reorganized the house and to offer burnt offerings, as was written in the law of Moses. Here we are with a direct reference to Moses. And what's interesting here is this guy, Matan, the priest of Baal here. Johnstone writes, the fundamental outrage for which that cult stands is the diversion of recognition that is due to God alone. The priest's name, Matan, gifts, given only in this context, expresses the benefits the people hope to receive from the cult, but which come from God alone, to whom alone the corresponding credit and thanks are to be given. And so they take the gatekeepers, the captains, nobles, governors. They march through the upper gate to the king's house. They set the king on the royal throne. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet after Athaliah had been put to death with the sword. And here I'm pointing out that sword is the last term, the last word in our verse here. And this connects all the way back to the beginning of our section here, 21:4, where Jehoram, under the influence of his wicked wife Athaliah, puts his brothers to death with the sword. So finally, we learn here that she was indeed put to death by the sword. So she lived by the sword and she died by the sword. Johnstone says the whole populace is enraptured with joy, and this cross-references 1 Chronicles 12:40. The city is at peace, the condition of absence of strife, when the whole system is in equilibrium. The usurper is dead. None of these elaborate installations is an end in itself, but the means whereby the quality of life intended by God for his people can be realized. And one last point that I did want to bring back in all of this was this phrase here about the seventh year. So as Lightheart points out, it's on the Sabbath day during this Sabbath year, because it's the seventh year. But Johnstone here has an interesting observation. He says, Ezekiel tells us that the inner eastern gate is open only on Sabbath and the first of the month for the sacrifice of the prince. There's a lot of detail going on that he's interacting with. I've kind of cut it out just for the sake of simplicity. But continuing, the most significant first day of the month is New Year's Day. And he cites Numbers 29:1. In the seventh month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work. For you, it is a day of blowing trumpets. I've actually, I think, read this verse because I've hit on this point before in a different video in the same series. Continuing with Johnstone, he says, the day of the celebration of the kingship of God, and by extension of his representative on earth, the Davidic king. Thus, the chronological note at the beginning of this chapter here, 23:1, may be still more significant. This is the first day of the seventh year, New Year's Day, when the whole tradition of Jerusalem theology is celebrated. So he thinks it's not just the seventh year, but it's the new year of the seventh year. So this is New Year's Day, the day of trumpets. On such a day, then, popular expectation and religious excitement are at their peak. On such a day, furthermore, it would be possible for a great assembly to gather in Jerusalem without exciting suspicion. Now, what's so significant, I think, about this, something that I think adds a whole other layer to this, is the argument that I think is very well argued that Jesus' birthday is September 11th, 3 BC, which would correspond to the New Year's Day, to the Day of Trumpets. And even going with other chronologies, like people like, goodness, his name is eluding me at the moment, the mysterious numbers of the Hebrew kings. Is it Thesan, maybe? I'm forgetting his name. But he points out that this was when new kings were inaugurated on the Day of Trumpets. It was on New Year Day. So even if they began reigning at some other point, officially, they were inaugurated on this day. And so it would make a lot of sense. They wait 7 years for the child to get a little bit older, but they choose this day because this is the inauguration day. But it's really powerful if that is the case, because, man, this is some deep foreshadowing of when the Messiah, the son of David, who also has Exodus themes, he also exiled into Egypt because Pharaoh, and by that I mean Herod, was seeking his life and was killing the sons of Israel. So he exiles into Egypt. Of course, that's a complete reverse of what's going on with Moses. But it's that same idea. It's the peril to the child motif. And so Jesus has so much of that stuff going on. And if his birthday is 3 BC, September 11th, it would have also been on this day. This is the same day. It's the New Year's Day. It's the Day of Trumpets. And here we have the reinstitution of the Davidic monarchy. The Davidic king is back on the throne. Whereas in the birth of the Messiah, again, you have the incarnation officially starting on the new year, where the king, the son of David, has arrived on earth. When Johnstone pointed that out, I thought that was very interesting that he goes in this direction. Of course, he doesn't connect it to any of that stuff. He doesn't interact at all with that aspect of the New Testament or anything. Also interesting, I think, in this light is kind of a frustration about the book of Chronicles, because Joash here is going to have these Moses typologies, this miraculous deliverance kind of thing, and he's going to ascend to the throne, and he's restarting the Davidic monarchy. I'm arguing here there's deep foreshadowing with the incarnation, the birth of the Messiah. But in spite of all of that, which we're not going to get to today, as high as the high is here in this section, it's going to come crashing down. He's not going to live up to the ideal that a Davidic king should. And that's going to be the pattern. It's a pattern we've seen and will continue to see, because it's the human condition. It's the unstoppable force and the immovable object. The unstoppable force being God's love and grace, the immovable object being our ability to mess that up, to squander it, to reject it. And we're not going to see the completion of the work until Christ. But that is chapters 21 through 23, and we will pick up next time with Joash repairing the temple. Things will start out okay, but things will go off track shortly thereafter, as has been the pattern. But I will see you guys then.